I didn't make a scene. I didn't raise my voice. I simply set my napkin on the table, pushed my chair back, and walked out of my own son's rehearsal dinner, while 43 people watched in silence. That was 8 months ago. My daughter-in-law's mother still hasn't spoken to me. My son called it an overreaction. My wife, the woman I'd been married to for 31 years, texted me 52 times that night. I read every single one. I didn't answer a single one. Let me go back to the beginning, because this story didn't start at a rehearsal dinner. It started the way most slow disasters start. Quietly, with small things I chose not to examine too closely. My name isn't important. What matters is that I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years building something I believed in. And somewhere in the last 4 of those years, the woman I built it with decided she was done. She just forgot to tell me. I worked in facilities management for a regional hospital network for most of my career. Not glamorous, not the kind of job that gets mentioned at dinner parties, but it was honest work. It paid well, and it meant that when our kids were growing up, the lights stayed on, the mortgage was paid, and my wife, I'll call her Carol, never once had to worry about money. She worked part-time as a dental hygienist when the kids were in middle school, then picked up more hours when they left for college. I respected that. I never once made her feel that her income was less important than mine. We had 2 kids. Our son Ryan is 34. Our daughter Michelle is 31. Ryan was always closer to his mother. Michelle always came to me when something was broken, a car, a relationship, a bad decision. I liked being that person. Still do. Carol and I had what I would have described 4 years ago as a solid marriage. Not passionate in the way movies pretend marriages should always be. Solid. Respectful. We had routines. Sunday mornings with coffee on the back porch. Friday dinners at the same Italian place we'd been going to for 20 years. She handled the social calendar. I handled the house maintenance and finances. It worked. Then Ryan got engaged to a woman named Brianna, and everything started moving in a direction I didn't fully understand until it was too late. Brianna's fine. I want to be clear about that. She's a perfectly decent young woman. But her family, her mother in particular, a woman I'll call Diane, came into our orbit with the quiet confidence of someone who had already decided where they stood in the pecking order. And from the first dinner we had together, it was clear that Diane had decided she stood above me. I noticed the way Carol laughed differently around Diane. Louder, more freely. I noticed how Carol started mentioning Diane's opinions about things. Decorating, travel, restaurants, with a kind of reverence she'd never used when talking about our own friends. I noticed how weekend plans started including Diane more and more, and how I was sometimes mentioned as an afterthought or not mentioned at all. I told myself it was just the wedding excitement. Mothers of the groom and bride forming a bond. Normal stuff. I was busy with work. I let it go. What I should not have let go was the January weekend 2 years before the wedding, when Carol told me she was driving 2 hours to visit her college roommate, and I found a gas station receipt on the kitchen counter from a town 45 minutes in the opposite direction. I picked up the receipt. I set it back down. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. I went to bed. That is the moment I'm least proud of. Not because I should have exploded, but because I already knew. Somewhere in the part of your brain that processes information before your conscious mind is ready to accept it, and I chose to look away. Over the following 18 months, there were other receipts, not always literal ones. Sometimes it was a charge on our joint account for a restaurant I'd never heard of, on a Tuesday night when Carol said she'd worked late. Sometimes it was the way she angled her phone away from me when a message came through. Sometimes it was just a changed energy, a distance that had nothing to do with busyness or stress or the natural rhythms of a long marriage, a distance that felt chosen. I started keeping notes, Not out of paranoia, out of the same methodical habit that had served me for 30 years in facilities management. When something seems like it might be a problem, you document before you act. You don't tear up the floor to find a leak until you've confirmed there's actually water somewhere it shouldn't be. By the time I had 6 months of notes, I'd confirmed there was water everywhere it shouldn't be. His name, I eventually learned, was Gary. He was 58. He ran a small landscaping company. He had been introduced to Carol through Diane, Brianna's mother, at some point during the early wedding planning, when Carol had been looking for someone to redo the side yard before the engagement party at our house. I want you to sit with that for a moment. The mother of my son's fiancée introduced my wife to the man my wife was having an affair with, and then continued to socialize with both of them. And then, I would later learn, invited Gary to my son's rehearsal dinner. I didn't know all of that yet on the night I first confirmed what was happening. I just knew the receipts added up. I knew the distances didn't match. I knew that the woman I had been sleeping next to for 31 years had, at some point in the last 2 years, stopped belonging entirely to our life together. I didn't hire a private investigator. I want to be honest about that because I've heard these stories where the husband spends a fortune on surveillance, and I've always thought, why? What does a photograph give you that the pattern doesn't already confirm? I trusted my own accounting. I had been doing it professionally for decades. What I did do was consult a lawyer. Quietly, a woman named Margaret, who had been referred to me by a colleague whose own divorce had been handled with what he described as zero drama and total precision. I liked the sound of that. I wanted zero drama. I wanted total precision. Margaret told me the same thing I already knew. Document, protect, don't confront until you're ready to move. So I kept documenting. I moved a portion of our savings into an individual account, which I was legally entitled to do and which Margaret advised. I gathered 7 years of financial records. I made copies of everything. I kept going to work. I kept making Sunday morning coffee. I kept going to Friday dinners at the Italian place. And I started watching how Carol and Diane operated together. What I saw was an alignment that went beyond two mothers planning a wedding. Diane made decisions about venue, about seating, about the rehearsal dinner format, and Carol endorsed them without consulting me. Not in a dismissive way, in the way of someone who has already decided that a certain person's judgment supersedes her husband's. When I offered an opinion about the rehearsal dinner guest count, Carol nodded politely in the way you nod at someone who has just said something sweet but irrelevant. I said nothing. I kept my notes. I waited. The rehearsal dinner was at a private room in a steakhouse about 20 minutes from our house. 43 guests. Ryan and Brianna, both families, close friends, wedding party. I had contributed $15,000 toward the rehearsal dinner costs at Carol's request, because Diane had suggested a venue that exceeded the original budget, and Carol had agreed before asking me. I paid it without argument. I noted it in my records. I got dressed that evening in the blue suit I'd worn to Michelle's college graduation. Carol was wearing a green dress I hadn't seen before. She looked beautiful. I told her so. She thanked me in the way you thank a stranger who holds a door. We drove to the steakhouse separately because Carol said she needed to arrive early to help Diane with some last-minute arrangements. I said that was fine. I drove alone, listened to a baseball game on the radio, and sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes after I arrived, just breathing. The private room was arranged with round tables, a head table for the wedding party, and a smaller table near the entrance for family. Parents of the bride and groom. I found the seating chart near the door and looked for my name. I was at a side table, not the family table, a side table near the back, between Ryan's college friend and a cousin of Brianna's I had never met. I stood there and looked at the seating chart for a long moment. My name, at a side table, at my own son's rehearsal dinner, at an event I had helped pay for. I looked at the family table. Carol's name was there, Diane's name was there. Brianna's father was there. And next to Carol's name, in the same clean printed font as everyone else's, was a name I recognized from 7 months of documentation. Gary. I want to tell you I felt rage. The movies would want me to feel rage. What I actually felt was a very specific, very quiet kind of clarity, the kind that arrives after a long time of almost knowing, when the last piece of information drops into place, and suddenly the picture is complete, and there is nothing left to wonder about. I set the seating chart back on the table. I walked to where Ryan was standing with Brianna near the bar, and I put my hand on his shoulder, and I said quietly, so only he could hear, "I love you. I'm proud of you. I'll be at your wedding tomorrow, and I will be everything a father should be, but I'm not staying tonight." He looked at me with the expression of someone who understands more than he wants to. He said, "Dad." I said, "Tomorrow. I'll explain tomorrow." I squeezed his shoulder once. I nodded at Brianna, who looked confused and a little stricken. I said, "Congratulations again. I mean that." And then I walked back through the room, past the seating chart, past the tables being set with bread baskets and water glasses, past Diane, who saw me and for just a moment went very still, and out through the front door of the steakhouse into the parking lot. I sat in my car. I turned on the baseball game. I drove home. I made myself a sandwich. I watched an hour of television. I went to bed at 10:15. The text started at 8:47 when I imagined Carol noticed I was gone. By midnight there were 52 of them. Some were angry. Some were confused. Some were, near the end, something that sounded almost like the Carol I had married, frightened and asking me to talk to her. I read all 52. I put my phone on the charger. I went to sleep. Here is what I need you to understand about that night and about the months that followed. I was not performing strength. I was not following a plan from a book or executing some calculated revenge. I was simply, finally, done performing a role in a script I had not agreed to. Done pretending that the receipts were explainable. Done pretending I hadn't seen what I had seen. Done sitting quietly at a side table while the architecture of my own humiliation was arranged around me by people who had counted on me not to say anything. The decision to leave that rehearsal dinner was not about anger. It was about self-respect arriving, late, like a guest who had gotten lost on the way, but had finally shown up. I went to Ryan's wedding the next day. I wore my blue suit again. I walked down the aisle. I shook Brianna's father's hand. I danced with Michelle. I gave a toast that made Ryan cry, and I meant every word of it. Gary was not at the wedding. I do not know if he was uninvited or simply chose not to come. I did not ask. Carol and I sat on opposite sides of the family table and were perfectly civil to each other for 6 hours. 3 days after the wedding, I asked Carol to sit down at the kitchen table, and I placed a folder in front of her. Inside the folder was a printed summary, dates, locations, expenditures, a timeline, along with a letter from Margaret's office indicating that I had initiated divorce proceedings. Carol looked at the folder for a long time without opening it. She said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Long enough." She asked if there was any possibility we could try counseling. I told her I had thought about that and that my answer was no. She asked why. I told her that counseling requires 2 people who want to rebuild something, and that I had watched her for 2 years make a series of choices that were not confused or impulsive, but deliberate and sustained. That a person who makes deliberate and sustained choices over 2 years is not in a crisis that counseling can fix. They have simply decided on a different life. And I had decided to let her have it. She cried. I handed her a box of tissues from the counter. I did not feel nothing. I want to be honest about that, too. I felt the particular grief of watching the end of something that had once been real. But I had been grieving privately for 7 months. I was by then further along in the process than she was. I had been mourning the marriage since January of the previous year, standing in a kitchen holding a gas station receipt from the wrong direction. The divorce took 9 months. It was not without difficulty. There were contested assets, disagreements about the house, a period of several weeks when Carol's attorney made aggressive claims about financial contributions that Margaret handled with efficient patience. But it concluded. We sold the house. I moved into a rental that was smaller than I expected and quieter than I feared. I started cooking more. I called Michelle on Sunday mornings instead of making coffee on the back porch. Ryan struggled with it. That's the honest truth, and I won't soften it. He loves his mother. He was not able, for a long time, to accept the full shape of what had happened. We had some hard conversations. I never spoke badly about Carol to him. Not once. Not in any conversation. But I also did not pretend that my departure from the rehearsal dinner had been irrational. I told him what I had seen. I told him what I had documented. I told him that his mother and I had reached the end of something and that I was sorry it had happened at a time that was supposed to be joyful for him. He came around, slowly. This past spring, he drove 2 hours to help me move a piece of furniture into my new apartment. He stayed for dinner. We watched a game together. When he left, he hugged me in the way he hadn't since he was about 12 years old. That was worth more to me than anything I could have said at that rehearsal dinner. There are things I would tell a younger version of myself if I could. I would say, the moment you pick up a receipt and set it back down without asking a question, you have made a choice. You can make that choice, but understand it is a choice, and its cost accumulates. I would say, documentation is not paranoia. Precision is not coldness. Knowing the full shape of a situation before you respond to it is not weakness. It is the only way to respond from a place of actual ground instead of reaction. I would say, when the moment comes when you finally have enough clarity to act, do it quietly. Do it completely. Do not perform the confrontation for an audience. Do not hand the other person the opportunity to reframe your response as instability or rage. Simply stand up. Set your napkin on the table. Walk out. Let the silence you leave behind say everything that words would only muddy. I would say, your dignity is not dependent on their acknowledgement of what they did. That's the part that's hardest to accept and also the most important. Carol has never, in any conversation we've had since that kitchen table meeting, offered what I would describe as a full accounting of what happened, or a genuine apology for the specific shape of the harm. I have stopped waiting for that. Not because I'm bitter, because I understand now that waiting for someone else to acknowledge your worth is just a different way of letting them continue to hold it. My worth is not in her accounting. It is not in Diane's seating chart. It never was. I'm 63 years old. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment with a small porch where I drink coffee on Sunday mornings. I'm retiring next spring. Michelle visits once a month and sometimes brings my granddaughter, who is 2, and who calls me something that sounds like Boompa, and who last month fell asleep on my chest while I was watching a baseball game. I did not lose my life when I lost my marriage. I found out what was left when the structure came down, and what was left was more solid than I had expected. Some people hear this story and they want to know if I'm angry. The answer is that I was for a while. Quietly, in the way that I seem to do most things. I was angry at the waste of it, the years of not looking, the accumulated cost of all those moments I chose comfort over clarity. I was angry at being seated at a side table in the story of my own life. But anger is expensive. Clarity is cheap. And the night I drove home from that rehearsal dinner with the baseball game on the radio, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt like myself. That turned out to be enough.